Alright guys, my name is the MetaGoblin. Today we're going to be discussing one of the most talked about discussion topics right now in the Classic WoW community, particularly Classic TBC community, and that is, should you re-roll if you currently play a warrior or a rogue in Classic for when Classic TBC or Legacy TBC, whatever it's going to be called, does in fact get released or announced at BlizzCon Live in February. Just before we jump in guys, I'm going to do that really irritating thing that YouTubers do, because apparently only 20% of the people who watch my videos are actually subscribed to the channel, and I would appreciate if you did quickly leave me a sub, because you have absolutely no idea how much that does actually in fact help. So to cut a long story short on this topic, if you want to play the Burning Crusade entirely for raiding, that is your main priority, is to do raiding and other PvE content, I wouldn't recommend playing a warrior or a rogue, and obviously DPS warrior. Although there might be a slight exception for a warrior, which I'll talk about later, but this is honestly my opinion, my personal recommendation from playing years and years on the Burning Crusade servers, and it's a general opinion of everyone I talk to who also have played TBC servers for an immense amount of time. However, if you're interested in doing arenas, battlegrounds, then I definitely would recommend playing a warrior or a rogue. And if raiding is more of a side objective compared to pushing gladiator in arenas, then yeah, definitely consider playing a warrior or a rogue, and let me explain why. By the way guys, my dad and the next door neighbours builders are having a competition of who can make the most amount of noise and ruin my video as much as possible, so there may be some bangs and clangs in this video, which I do apologise for. I will try and cut it out in editing software. And the simple cold truth guys is that in tier 4 raiding, and honestly in the entirety of Burning Crusade raiding, ranged DPS do more damage. And they do a lot more damage. They do about 30% more damage than any melee could probably ever hope for. The only way that a melee can really compete with a ranged DPS is if they're decked out in a lot of gear and obviously have the legendary warglaives. They're very simply more powerful as classes, plus many of the fights are range friendly but anti-melee. Just one of the many examples, the last boss on Karazhan, you gain a debuff called Enfeeble, which reduces your health to 1, which means if you get hit by 1 damaging ability, you are totally toast. So melee have to totally move out of melee range to avoid Shadow Nova for a significant amount of time, so there's less uptime on bosses, and then range can kind of just chill and can continue doing DPS. So overall rangers have better uptime on bosses than melee, which allows them to do more damage. But then sometimes melee have more uptime on bosses and can actually overtake ranged on DPS, but those opportunities are far apart and very few. And another cold hard truth is guilds will simply prioritise recruiting ranged DPS over melee. Melee have less priority, but they are still essential, okay? But in tier 4 raiding you're definitely going to get benched a lot, maybe a little less in tier 5 and tier 6 depending on how hardcore your guild is. Honestly, some guilds will probably only bring you for Illidan for the chance of you getting warglaives. They're that serious about raiding, so that's something to bear in mind. Obviously raid groups don't want to waste all of the loot that's been dropped, like big two-handed weapons and one-handed weapons, including the daggers that are, best in slot for warriors and rogues. They obviously want to prepare for the future and have a more balanced setup, but overall 80% of your DPS slots are going to be taken up by a ranged DPS, and that's probably what most guilds are going to do. You will very likely get put in what's called a flex group, so when you're doing tier 4 raiding, and when Zul'Aman is released too, you'll have 3 raid groups for Karazhan, so 3 10-man raid groups, which is a total of 4 core raiders, and then obviously the other raids only require 25 men, which means you're inevitably going to have a group of 5 people who are called, basically in a group called the flex group, who will be rotated in and out of the main raid group. It's basically the bench group. And as a rogue or fury warrior, this will very likely end up being you, and you will only be rotated into the group if a ranged DPS is just unable to actually raid, which obviously does happen from time to time. So a lot of the time, the only time you will get into a raid is if a ranged DPS has to take a day off. You can obviously increase the chances of you getting invited to the raid. First of all, a warrior could re-roll into arm spec, because honestly if you re-roll into arm spec you probably will get a more permanent spot, because you can massively boost the hunter's damage in a raid with a cheeky little debuff that's deep in the arms tree. Secondly, I'd recommend having level working so you can provide the group with drums of battle, which is basically a mini bloodlust, and it's very useful for a raid group, particularly if you're doing progression raiding, so that would definitely increase the chances of you actually getting invited into the group. Thirdly, be as friendly and as useful to the guild as possible, or be a guild officer. Or lastly, reroll protection. So right now I will give you my honest, unfiltered advice. First of all, if you're going to play a warrior, if you decide you're going to play a warrior in TBC, this is my honest advice. First of all, like I said before, I'd recommend playing arms instead of fury, so you will be more useful to the raid and more likely to get a permanent raid spot. Plus, you will have priority when it comes to getting big two-handed weapon drops, which normally just get disenchanted anyway, because they're only really useful to either an arms warrior or a retribution paladin, and there's only going to be one retribution paladin as well. Well, it might be two, but more than likely only going to be one. You will only have to, actually compete against them for those two-handed weapon drops. And when it comes to one-handed weapon drops, particularly swords, you probably just get given them anyway if there's no rogue in your group. But you obviously be a bit more competition on axes and maces because you have to roll against enhancement shamans. But a lot of the time, it's actually really fast and easy to gear up as an arms warrior overall. Secondly, level up level working for drums, again, so to increase the chance of getting a raid group, which should be more useful to the raid. Thirdly, only get blacksmithing if you want to push gladiator and crash storm herald. So if you're a casual PvPer, you may want to consider another profession. But if you really want to go for gladiators, you definitely want to get blacksmithing to get Storm Herald, because it's such a ridiculously good weapon. It's a slow weapon speed, which means it scales over your damaging abilities, and also has a really cheeky 4-second stun, which doesn't have diminishing returns with other stun abilities. So yeah, that's really strong. If PvP is more of your side priority compared to raiding, and if you are going to play arm spec and actually get invited to raids a lot, then I honestly wouldn't recommend going for blacksmithing, because it will cost a lot of money to craft your Storm Heralds. However, if you're rich anyway from Classic WoW, then it won't be that much of an issue. But honestly, I would go for a less selfish profession, because blacksmithing is obviously a profession more tailored for you. It'd be better to go for a profession that's more useful to the guild, again to increase the chances of you getting invited to raids, because if you're being very useful to the guild, everyone will like you, and then yeah, you will get a more solid raid spot, particularly if you're playing arm spec like I mentioned. Although you can still go for blacksmithing if you really want to, because really good recipes will start dropping in raids in the later tiers, so that may also be useful to you. Now let's move on to my honest advice for rogues. Personally, I wouldn't play a rogue unless I'm extremely serious about playing arena and pushing for gladiator, and that's my main goal in TBC, is to just join arenas and enjoy myself in a PvP focused environment, because you will be benched just pretty much most of the time, unfortunately. There may be some raid groups that won't be that bothered, like more casual groups, but on the large part you will be in that flex group and you will be benched quite a lot, unfortunately. Unless you're a guild officer, then you may get away with it. I imagine, like my guild and many other guilds will do the same, they're already talking about what their plans are going to be for TBC, whether there's going to be rerolls and stuff like that. So, I imagine what I'd recommend is for most guilds to have a little bit of a meeting, a bit of a coalition on it, have a separate Discord channel for it, for everyone to talk about what their plans are going to be for TBC, so everyone can kind of come to a mutual understanding of whether they should re-roll or not. Probably should have saved that point for last, but anyway. Second point, do arena and just enjoy yourself, okay? Because Rogue is a ridiculously strong class in TBC with a very high skill ceiling. You're going to have a lot of fun pushing for arena rating and all that kind of thing. And yeah, do some raids on the side a couple times a month with your guild. Again, you're probably going to be in that flex group, so you'll only ever be invited when a ranged DPS isn't actually available to raid. There may be a situation where you do get a permanent raid spot because, you've been with a guild for so long in classic TBC and you're friends with everyone and you're one of the only few people who actually want to play Rogue, then you may actually get a permanent spot, which is fair enough. All the power to you, that would be really great. But some guilds obviously are going to take things a little bit more serious than others. And if you're going into TBC like changing server, totally starting fresh and joining a new guild, then you are going to have issues, unfortunately. Particularly if you didn't play any classic WoW at all and not part of any kind of community or guild. And then thirdly, definitely level up level working for the awesome gear, but obviously because it provides drums, and a rogue with drums, very likely to actually get invited to a raid group and be actually rotated into the raid and swapped out from a ranged DPS, and not just invited when a ranged DPS can't make the raid. You will actually be rotated in just because you've got drums, and a ranged DPS like a warlock or a hunter will be rotated out, although it's probably more likely to be a Ret Paladin or Enhancement Shaman or an Elder Shaman that actually gets rotated out. But anyway guys, that is my very honest, clear and no BS answer to this topic. I'm going to end it there. My name is MetaGoblin. To the next video. Ciao.